A lot has happened here at Tea Creek. I'd love to talk about Tea Creek, but you know what? I'd rather talk about reconciliation. So I'm going to encourage, if you want to connect with me and see how you can help, please reach out to me directly. I'm happy to do that. What I want to do now is talk about, say, 5 things that could change to support Indigenous people and nations and initiatives that can make the biggest difference. So one of the biggest barriers is access to land for Indigenous people and initiatives. It's very difficult if you are an Indigenous person, especially on reserve, to access the tools to purchase land. I, for example, have never been able to get a mortgage from a bank. Even though I'm off reserve and my activities are off reserve, there's just systemic racism that exists, very much so, very still to this day in large quantities. And then there's sort of this structural legal problems, such as that a band, an Indian band, a First Nation that's based on reserve, is still not allowed to own land off reserve. So they have to create a corporate entity to buy land off reserve. Crazy. And then that leads to all kinds of vulnerabilities, which we could talk about another time. So one thing we'd like to see, and that I'd like to be involved in, is getting a program, a trust up and running that is dedicated to returning land to Indigenous people at favorable rates or no rates. So land returning and creating an initiative to actually do that is really important. We see models of that working in other places like the United States. There's different trusts in different places that are active and successful. Next thing I want to talk about very quickly is money. There's some things that can be changed. One is just simply more of it. Understanding that Indigenous people and initiatives are much higher barriered in terms, we're going to face more friction and difficulty. We need to make it easier. One of our struggles at Tea Creek is we're expected to represent ourselves differently to each funder, depending on what they're doing. No one's funding us to do what we do, to be Indigenous-led, land-based, culturally safe. Reducing the paperwork burden is a huge one for us, where you see First Nations that are under capacity, who need the money the most, don't get it because they don't have the capacity to get the money. And then initiatives that already have the money and have the capacity get the most because they have the people to write all those proposals and reports. So the model that's worked really well for us is get out there, meet people, get on the ground, see what's going on, see who deserves support and support them. Cut the checks. Another thing we find really frustrating is working with Indigenous funds that they have a goal of 100% success. You are not allowed to fail as an Indigenous person. Funds and initiatives that are mainstream calculate in failure. And we know as entrepreneurs, as business people, that failure is one of your best teachers. Being allowed to struggle and not be 100% successful and perfect is critical. And that expectation in funding formulas is a huge problem to people who are already high barrier. It cuts out all those single moms and dads who live here, who are looked at as high risk, and so they don't even get a chance, no matter how much paperwork they do. Third one is people. We need to actually start training and retraining people. My great-grandparents were incredible business people, but they did not go to Indian residential school. The subsequent generations on my Indigenous side were taken and tortured and had horrific experience and had this knowledge stripped from them. So I've had to relearn how to be an entrepreneur, how to be a business person, because my parents weren't able to teach me. My grandparents weren't able to teach me. And I see an incredibly young Indigenous population that is hungry to move forward, to thrive, and there are very few resources for them to learn. Fairly often, opportunities get thrown out there for like Indigenous youth, and then we say, oh, nobody applied, I guess nobody wants it. No, they want it, but they need to be supported. We can't just say, hey, show up and things are going to go great. We need to get out there and take reconciliation action and help our people get going. The fourth thing I want to talk about is Indigenous-LED. We need to change the criteria for funding and support from Indigenous ownership to Indigenous-LED. The problem is that a lot of non-Indigenous initiatives, companies, people who are already in a sector already have all kinds of advantages and privileges. Funding will move and say, hey, this is just for Indigenous initiatives. And you need to be Indigenous owned. And so the non-Indigenous parties, all they need to do is find an Indigenous party to be a 51% owner. But often all the operations and the impact on the ground is going to that non-Indigenous party. And that is a problem. And we see it all the time, everywhere. The solution is to move to Indigenous-LED, where you need to see Indigenous people making a majority of the decisions every day within that initiative and organization, such as Tea Creek. We have over 90% Indigenous people at every level of our organization. And we see that as being the key to making a difference on the ground. Get to Indigenous-LED, force initiatives to be Indigenous-LED, and then you start making a real difference. So the final thing that I wanted to talk about is public policy. So Indigenous people have suffered incredible traumas on top of traumas on top of traumas over hundreds of years, largely thanks to public policy. And we'd really like to see changes to public policy. That means laws in this country at every level to reverse and start reconciliation, take action. One really simple example for us here is we are in the Agricultural Land Reserve. We know multiple First Nations who have purchased land in Agricultural Land Reserve and are not allowed to practice Indigenous agriculture on their own land because of how terrible ALR rules are for Indigenous people. Famously, that healing center where they applied to do a healing center on the ALR and were rejected. That's crazy. We got to fix that, okay? So those are 5 things that we hear a lot. We would really like to be involved in the solutions. If you'd like to engage with us at Tea Creek, we've got a lot to offer. And again, I just really want to thank you for inviting me to say a few words. And hopefully one day we'll have a meeting up here at Tea Creek and we'll get going on all of these changes, fixes, and solutions, because we got to do it. Like I said in that short video, the time is now, and everybody benefits when Indigenous people benefit. The land benefits, the economy benefits, our social well-being benefits, our food security benefits. There's all kinds, and there's no downside to reconciliation. Thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you again. Bye.